Despite every Windows mistake and every breakthrough of its alternatives, Windows is still as strong and dominant as ever. Or is it? I'm no Vsauce, but I am Michael and I say it isn't. It might not be the year people flee to macOS and Linux en masse, but after having one disaster after another, Microsoft themselves have published an open letter to the community, promising to do better and asking not to leave them. It's gotten to the point that when Windows tweeted a new era of PC, some of us legitimately felt mortified, because knowing Windows, it can go very badly. But the real question is, can they do a 180, or is it time for many of us to finally part ways with Windows? Let's start with the obvious. You can only game on a Windows machine, and honestly, it's becoming an outdated stereotype. You see, in the 1980s, over 40 years ago, the IBM PC architecture became the dominant personal computer standard. A number of manufacturers produced compatible machines, creating a large and rapidly growing market. That allowed for hardware competition to drive prices down and allowed developers to target a commonly used architecture instead of many incompatible systems. Competitors like Apple, Commodore, and Atari did exist, but the IBM-compatible market just grew faster, and DirectX, which was introduced in 1995, provided standardized APIs for graphics, audio, input devices, and networking. This allowed for a dramatically reduced development complexity, and the rise of 3D graphics only accelerated Windows adaptation. Fast forward to today, and many people default to Windows for gaming either simply out of habit or because of the online discourse. But right now is probably the best time to pay attention to the alternatives. For example, Valve's Steam Deck is one of the best options if you want a console-like experience. It gives you an excellent Steam integration and it's designed specifically for gaming. So if you mainly play Steam games, SteamOS or SteamOS-like distributions such as Vsauce is probably the best non-Windows experience. Speaking of Vsauce, it's one of the best desktop gaming OS that you can try for yourself, but keep in mind that some multiplayer games with anti-cheat systems still don't work. And then there's the third option, which is macOS. I know, but hear me out. While macOS is generally not the first choice for dedicated gaming, the modern Apple Silicon chips are surprisingly capable and the number of native games is only growing. And even then, if a certain game that you want to play is unavailable, you can use a service like GeForce Now and never stress about upgrading your machine ever again. So as you can see, Windows is not the only capable platform for gaming anymore. But even in general terms, Linux, for example, is actually growing in popularity. It had 1% of gaming market share for years, but recently, it's been growing to 2%, 3% and beyond. And Valve, of all people, is actively exploring and developing the infrastructure. After the failure of the original SteamOS, they spent years investing in Proton. It's a compatibility layer that allows Windows games to run natively on Linux-based operating systems like SteamOS. And after the release of Steam Deck, Linux gaming started becoming more and more accessible to ordinary people who don't want to deal with terminals all the time. It also shifted the perception of Linux in the general market, and the community only accelerated the momentum. So while other companies and platforms are actively building something new, Windows is also very actively enshittificating their system, that is. Honestly, it's getting ridiculous. You have suggested apps in the startup menu, promotional notifications for Microsoft services, the system begging you to use things like Microsoft Edge, OneDrive, and Microsoft 365, just like recommendations and sponsored content in some parts of the interface. Since when did my PC become a billboard for ads? And as you can see, I have a bone to pick here. Because if a user has already paid for an operating system, it should not behave like a free tier of some ad-infested platform. On top of that, Microsoft's actively pushing AI onto its users. Complex and ugly UI, aggressive updates that can literally break your entire system, and data collection, which is a whole other conversation. But to Microsoft's credit, they did try to counteract and win some of the users back with what's called Xbox Full-Screen Experience. The idea is simple. It boots directly into a console-like gaming interface, hides most of the traditional Windows desktop, frees up some RAM and CPU resources for gaming, and reduces background Windows processes. In other words, it makes Windows feel less like a PC and more like an Xbox. That begs the question though, why did Microsoft only do that now when they realized that they're losing their market share? They've owned the Xbox platform for over 2 decades and could have reduced Windows bloat, improved controller support, and optimized resource usage years ago. But the truth is that it was the competition that forced Microsoft. But even now, they're not fully forced to act quickly. Companies like Dell, Lenovo, Asus, Acer, and others still sell pre-built computers that come with Windows. And that's the issue. Microsoft has gotten way too comfortable with the idea that Windows is the default operating system that people use. When you visit a website, say Lenovo's website, you see Windows machines everywhere, and if you want something different, like Linux, well, good luck. The average user never seriously considers Linux, simply because it's either absent or is buried deep down at the bottom of the list. And historically, Microsoft has provided different forms of support for PC manufacturers, like co-marketing funds, advertising support, certification programs, and sales incentives. And because of all that, most people don't consciously choose Windows. It just happens to be the most visible option. If you want to buy a laptop and go to a shop, most laptops that you will see will have Windows pre-installed. So Microsoft heavily dominates the market, and they feel, or at least used to feel, untouchable. But believe it or not, the biggest threat to Windows might not be Linux at all. It's Apple. Now, before you throw potatoes at me, hear me out. First of all, Apple Silicon. The biggest turning point was Apple's transition from Intel processors to its own chips, starting with the Apple M1 and continuing to refine the chip series through later generations. This gave Apple control over performance, power efficiency, manufacturing costs, and independence from Intel. Today, MacBooks have great battery life, strong performance, and they're more efficient than many competing laptops. But here's the kicker. On top of improving the machines themselves, Apple is getting more and more aggressive about offering strong value rather than relying solely on premium branding. Take MacBook Neo, for example. It's cheaper than MacBook Air or Pro versions, and it's actually powerful enough for students and most people who don't push their systems to the limit. And even after the recent price hike, it still cuts directly into Microsoft market because it starts at $699, which has historically been Microsoft territory. So if Apple continues to improve their value proposition, then more and more people will actively seek out to buy MacBooks, which is, again, bad news for Microsoft. But even that is not as bad as the fact that a lot of PC enthusiasts are simply done with Windows and are ready for alternatives. They might not be the biggest group of users, but they absolutely influence everyone around them. They recommend laptops to friends and family, they build PCs themselves, and they write tutorials. These people have a lot of reach, and back in the day, a lot of these enthusiasts used to actually like Windows, but today it's more of a I use Windows because I have to kind of thing. Like, tell me, would you still use Windows if all of your programs and games would run perfectly on Linux or macOS? Exactly. Nobody wants to pay good money for an OS that has ads in it, or pushes OneDrive and Edge everywhere, or has a decline in search quality. And Microsoft sees it, but they might be a year or 5 years too late. Sure, they're trying to be more selective with AI integrations, improve Windows search, optimize the taskbar, and improve the gaming experience with Xbox mode. But it took way too long. I have been using Windows machines my whole life. Around 2 or 3 years ago, I bought a decent custom-built PC for work and video game development. It took less than a year for an update to break my internet. And a while ago, I needed a laptop, but given how much will depend on that laptop, I didn't even consider a Windows machine. And that's the issue. Microsoft's reputation has been declining and causing lifelong users like me to turn away. Because nobody likes cosplay in an IT department every time something fails in the system, or when another ad pops up and you have to figure out how to get rid of it. So maybe it is time to part ways and look for alternatives. I've been Michael. See you in the next one.